The morning light barely touched the cracked concrete steps of the Southside Precinct. It was the kind of place where voices echoed even when no one spoke, the walls carrying the weight of every word ever shouted within them. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a constant reminder of time dragging on in a space where urgency never slept. Officers in worn uniforms moved with practiced indifference, their boots scuffing against the tiles as papers shuffled and phones rang out in sharp bursts. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't impressive, but for many of the officers who worked here, it was home, or at least the closest thing to it. Samantha Reynolds stepped out of her car, smoothing the creases of her dark blazer. She wasn't nervous, not exactly, but there was a tension sitting heavy in her chest. She could feel it in the way her fingers tightened around the handle of her briefcase, in the way her heels clicked against the pavement a little too quickly. Today wasn't just another day at the precinct. As she approached the entrance, a sharp voice pierced the quiet. "Put your hands where I can see them now." The command sliced through the stale air, echoing down the dim hallway like a blade. The room fell silent, save for the slow shuffle of feet as she turned, eyes locking onto the officer standing in the doorway. His stance was rigid, his baton tapping against his palm with an almost predatory rhythm. "I said hands up! You think you can just walk in here without clearance? Who the hell do you think you are?" His voice dripped with authority, a practiced tone designed to intimidate. Samantha stood frozen, not out of fear, but disbelief. The weight of every eye in the room pressed down on her. The dozen officers who had been busy with their tasks now looking on, smirking, pretending to be busy, but none intervening. The officer stepped closer, his boots striking the floor like drum beats, each step louder than the last. "You don't belong here. I don't know who let you in, but you're about 2 seconds away from being dragged out of here in cuffs." Her breath hitched, but she didn't flinch. Not yet. She held her ground as he advanced, his baton lifted slightly, a silent threat. "Search her." The words cut deep. They weren't just an order. They were a declaration of who he thought she was, of what he assumed about her. Laughter erupted from one corner of the room, an uncomfortable sound that made her jaw tighten. "Better get comfortable, sweetheart. We don't do VIP treatment here." The officer stepped even closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "You walk in here like you own the place, like you're somebody. Let me guess, you're here to file a complaint about your neighbor's dog, or maybe looking for a friend in lockup?" He leaned in, his breath foul with coffee. "Newsflash, this ain't a charity. You're in the wrong place." Samantha's fists tightened at her sides, but her voice remained steady. "You don't know who I am." The officer sneered. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. You're trouble. That's what you are." He reached for her arm, but she stepped back, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Don't touch me." The room froze. The laughter grew louder this time, mocking. "You hear that? She thinks she's in charge." The officer's baton lifted higher, his voice menacing. "You're about to learn how things work around here." But then something unexpected happened. A voice from the entrance sliced through the tension like a knife. The room turned, eyes wide in shock. The laughter stopped instantly. What followed left everyone stunned. Not just what Samantha said next, but the authority with which she said it. It wasn't just who she was, it was what she represented. As the truth began to unfold, it became clear that the officer and the department would soon be faced with consequences they never saw coming. Samantha Reynolds wasn't just any visitor. She was the one holding their future in her hands. This is a story about power, prejudice, and karma. A story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about authority and accountability. Stay with us because what happens next will shock you. We stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and any form of injustice. This channel is a safe space where powerful stories are told to inspire change, spark conversations, and uplift voices that matter. To our viewers, whether you are Black or have ever faced prejudice, you are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone. Get ready for a gripping, emotional story filled with twists, justice, and empowerment. If you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our mission of telling stories that matter. Enjoy the story. It was her first day, and first impressions always mattered. Samantha Reynolds had learned that the hard way. Her father had always told her, respect isn't something you ask for, it's something you take. And she'd carried those words with her through every obstacle life had thrown her way, through every condescending glance in law school, through every whispered rumor in the academy about quotas and diversity hires. She knew how to handle judgment. She'd been doing it her whole life. But as she climbed the steps and pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Southside Precinct, the weight in her chest didn't lift. The air felt different here. The officers in this precinct weren't just used to the chaos of the streets, they thrived on it. As she walked through the lobby, she could feel their eyes on her. They weren't subtle. A tall man with a shaved head leaned against the front desk, arms crossed over a chest that seemed to have spent more time in the gym than on patrol. His name tag read J. Daniels. He didn't move when she approached, not even pretending to be busy. Instead, he looked her up and down with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting away with it. "Can I help you?" His voice was casual, almost bored, but the edge in it was impossible to miss. Samantha held his gaze, her posture straightening. "I need to speak with the captain." Daniels smirked. "You and half the city. What's it about?" Her jaw tightened. She'd dealt with men like him before, men who measured their worth by how easily they could intimidate someone else. "It's about work," she replied evenly. He raised an eyebrow. "Work? What are you, a lawyer? Social services? Or is this about a complaint?" The assumption stung, even though she should have expected it. Still, she forced herself to remain calm. "I need to see him now." Daniels tilted his head, clearly unimpressed. "And I need to finish my coffee, but we can't all get what we want." Before she could respond, another voice cut in. "You're wasting your time, Daniels. She doesn't belong here." A second officer, younger but just as smug, walked up and leaned against the desk beside him. Samantha's eyes flicked to his name tag. Harris. He was grinning like this was a joke he'd been waiting all morning to tell. "Looks like someone got lost on their way to HR, Harris said, earning a chuckle from Daniels. Samantha felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. "I'm here for business," she said, her voice sharper this time. Daniels straightened, his expression hardening. "If you don't lower your tone, I'll be the one handling your business, and I don't think you'll like how that goes." It was a threat, plain and simple. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She'd prepared for this, spent years preparing for moments just like this. Still, the sound of Daniel's baton tapping against his palm sent a cold wave down her spine. "You think you're in charge here?" he asked, taking a step closer. "You think you can just walk in here and start making demands?" Harris laughed again. "I say we toss her in holding until she learns some manners." Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Daniels reached out and grabbed her arm. The contact was firm, too firm. It wasn't just restraint, it was dominance, a reminder that he held the power in this room. "Let go of me," she said, her voice sharp enough to draw the attention of a few officers nearby. Daniels didn't move. The words hung in the air, heavier than the tension already filling the room. Samantha's pulse quickened. She could feel every pair of eyes on her now, waiting to see what she'd do next. And then the door behind her opened. The sound alone wasn't enough to break the tension, but the presence that entered the room did. Conversations halted, movements slowed. Even Daniels released his grip, though the smirk never left his face. Samantha turned, meeting the gaze of the person who had just stepped inside. The look they exchanged lasted only a second, but it was enough for her to know she wasn't alone, for her to know this wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because while Daniels and Harris saw just another woman they thought they could push around, they had no idea who she really was. And soon, they'd regret finding out. The sound of Samantha's heels echoed sharply against the cold, polished tiles of the precinct floor. Each step was heavy with purpose, but tinged with the weight of everything that had happened earlier. The day had already stretched longer than it should have, yet the tension in the building refused to ease. The voices of officers murmuring in the background, the occasional ring of a phone, the muffled sound of typing. Each noise seemed to create a strange rhythm that only emphasized how out of place she felt. Despite her best efforts to maintain composure, the glances that followed her every move chipped away at her resolve. It was her first day, and first impressions always mattered. Samantha Reynolds had learned that the hard way. Her father had always told her, respect isn't something you ask for, it's something you take. And she'd carried those words with her through every obstacle life had thrown her way, through every condescending glance in law school, through every whispered rumor in the academy about quotas and diversity hires. She knew how to handle judgment. She'd been doing it her whole life. But as she climbed the steps and pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Southside precinct, the weight in her chest didn't lift. The air felt different here. The officers in this precinct weren't just used to the chaos of the streets. They thrived on it. As she walked through the lobby, she could feel their eyes on her. They weren't subtle. A tall man with a shaved head leaned against the front desk, arms crossed over a chest that seemed to have spent more time in the gym than on patrol. His name tag read J. Daniels. He didn't move when she approached, not even pretending to be busy. Instead, he looked her up and down with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting away with it. "Can I help you?" His voice was casual, almost bored, but the edge in it was impossible to miss. Samantha held his gaze, her posture straightening. "I need to speak with the captain." Daniels smirked. "You and half the city. What's it about?" Her jaw tightened. She'd dealt with men like him before, men who measured their worth by how easily they could intimidate someone else. "It's about work," she replied evenly. He raised an eyebrow. "Work? What are you, a lawyer? Social services? Or is this about a complaint?" The assumption stung, even though she should have expected it. Still, she forced herself to remain calm.
Daniels tilted his head, clearly unimpressed. "And I need to finish my coffee, but we can't all get what we want." Before she could respond, another voice cut in. "You're wasting your time, Daniels. She doesn't belong here." A second officer, younger but just as smug, walked up and leaned against the desk beside him. Samantha's eyes flicked to his name tag, Harris. He was grinning like this was a joke he'd been waiting all morning to tell. "Looks like someone got lost on their way to HR, Harris said, earning a chuckle from Daniels. Samantha felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. "I'm here for business," she said, her voice sharper this time. Daniels straightened, his expression hardening. "If you don't lower your tone, I'll be the one handling your business, and I don't think you'll like how that goes." It was a threat, plain and simple. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She'd prepared for this, spent years preparing for moments just like this. Still, the sound of Daniel's baton tapping against his palm sent a cold wave down her spine. "You think you're in charge here?" he asked, taking a step closer. You think you can just walk in here and start making demands? Harris laughed again. I say we toss her in holding until she learns some manners. Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Daniels reached out and grabbed her arm. The contact was firm, too firm. It wasn't just restraint, it was dominance, a reminder that he held the power in this room. Let go of me, she said, her voice sharp enough to draw the attention of a few officers nearby. Daniels didn't move. The words hung in the air, heavier than the tension already filling the room. Samantha's pulse quickened. She could feel every pair of eyes on her now, waiting to see what she'd do next. And then the door behind her opened. The sound alone wasn't enough to break the tension, but the presence that entered the room did. Conversations halted, movements slowed. Even Daniels released his grip, though the smirk never left his face. Samantha turned, meeting the gaze of the person who had just stepped inside. The look they exchanged lasted only a second, but it was enough for her to know she wasn't alone, for her to know this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because while Daniels and Harris saw just another woman they thought they could push around, they had no idea who she really was. And soon they'd regret finding out. The sound of Samantha's heels echoed sharply against the cold, polished tiles of the precinct floor. Each step was heavy with purpose, but tinged with the weight of everything that had happened earlier. The day had already stretched longer than it should have, yet the tension in the building refused to ease. The voices of officers murmuring in the background, the occasional ring of a phone, the muffled sound of typing. Each noise seemed to create a strange rhythm that only emphasized how out of place she felt. Despite her best efforts to maintain composure, the glances that followed her every move chipped away at her resolve. She didn't trust him just yet, but she knew one thing for sure. There was more to this precinct than she had originally realized, and Daniels was at the heart of it. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Samantha could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, the tension, not just from Daniels, but from everything in the air around her. There were things happening in this building, things that had been hidden in plain sight, and she had every intention of exposing them. As she left her desk and made her way to the break room, the murmurs of officers filled the space, their conversations dropping to silence as soon as she entered. Every pair of eyes seemed to follow her, but Samantha didn't let it affect her. She wasn't going to cower. Not now, not ever. Daniel's words echoed in her mind, the weight of his warning still hanging in the air, but she shook it off. Respect isn't optional. She had earned hers before, and she would do it again. But she wasn't going to follow their rules, not the ones they thought were set in stone. She would make her own path. She reached the vending machine, staring at the selection in front of her, but not really seeing it. Her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of what she had learned. Something was off about the way things were being run, the way Daniels carried himself like he owned this place, like no one dared question him. It wasn't just his attitude. There was something darker at play. Just then, the door to the break room opened, and she turned, bracing herself for the next round of tension. But it wasn't Daniels. It was another officer, one she hadn't seen before. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp eyes that immediately met hers. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, but with a hint of concern. Samantha hesitated. She'd spent so much time keeping her guard up, so much time shutting people out. But there was something different about this officer. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, like he actually saw her, not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, though she couldn't quite keep the exhaustion from seeping through. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer. "If you need anything," If you want to talk, don't hesitate." For the first time that day, Samantha allowed herself to soften just a fraction, nodding in return. She didn't know who he was or why he was offering his support, but right now, it was the last thing she expected, and maybe the thing she needed most. She left the break room, her thoughts still racing. The night was settling in around her, and she knew the next steps weren't going to be easy. Daniels wasn't going to back off. He had too much to lose, but neither was she. And whatever came next, she was ready to face it head on. Because if there was one thing she knew for sure, it was this. The only way forward was to expose the truth. And if she had to tear this place down piece by piece to get there, she would. Samantha Reynolds wasn't just another woman who didn't belong. She was about to make sure everyone in this precinct knew that. This isn't spiraling. It's exactly what needed to happen. Daniels crossed a line, and now the rest of them have to know there's accountability here, she said sharply, her gaze unwavering. Ramirez ran a hand through his hair, frustration clear on his face. "You think it's that simple? You think the whole department is just going to fall in line because you did what you had to do? You're making enemies, Samantha. People who have power, people who can make your life miserable. This could ruin you, not just Daniels." Samantha's eyes burned with determination. "I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to do the right thing. I don't care who I'm up against." "That's exactly the problem," Ramirez said, his voice quieter but heavy with warning. "Doing the right thing is one thing, but this is bigger than you think. There are people who will stop at nothing to protect their own. You're messing with a whole network of power here, and they don't play by your rules." Samantha's chest tightened. "And that's why it has to stop," she said, her voice resolute. "You said it yourself. This place isn't like the others. If we don't change the way things are done, nothing's going to get better. You can't hide corruption behind loyalty." Ramirez stared at her, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowing as he weighed her words. He seemed torn between agreeing and fearing the consequences. "You're walking a tightrope, Samantha, but I see where you're coming from. Just be careful. The next steps you take could be the ones that change everything, or destroy you." Before Samantha could respond, the door to the office burst open again. Harris stood there, his face even more pale than before, his eyes wide with panic. "You need to see this," he said urgently, his voice trembling. Without a word, Ramirez gestured for Harris to lead them out. They followed Harris down the hallway, the buzz of anxious conversations growing louder as they neared the source of the commotion. Officers gathered around the TV, their faces tense and serious, as though the air itself had thickened with disbelief. The sound of the footage was the first thing Samantha heard. Then the familiar image of Daniels's confrontation from earlier in the day flashed across the screen. It was worse than she had imagined. The footage was shaky, obviously taken from a phone, but it was unmistakable. Daniels's sneer, his baton hovering threateningly over her, his words cutting through the tension. "You're about to learn how things work around here." The scene played over and over, the cruel words and the aggression captured for all to see. Samantha's heart dropped into her stomach. She had known it was bad, but seeing it like this, out in the open, in front of everyone, it hit differently. The officers in the room exchanged uneasy glances, some looking ashamed, others angry, but none of them spoke. Ramirez's voice broke through the silence. "Where did this come from?" Harris shifted uncomfortably. "It's everywhere. Someone must have leaked the security footage. It's all over social media." Samantha's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had no idea who had leaked the footage, but now that it was out there was no going back. Before anyone could react, the door to the precinct slammed open. A reporter, microphone in hand, barged through, followed by a camera crew. The room exploded into chaos as questions were hurled at her, the cameras flashing like a storm. "Lieutenant Reynolds, Can you comment on the video? Is it true Officer Daniels has been suspended? Is this part of a larger investigation into corruption in the department? Ramirez immediately stepped in front of Samantha, raising his hands to block the cameras. No comments right now, he said, his voice firm but strained. This is an active situation. The reporters kept shouting their questions, but Samantha couldn't hear them anymore. Her focus was on the officers around her, their faces full of resentment, anger, even betrayal. The looks they gave her as she walked past stung worse than the questions. It was as though they were already choosing sides, and she was not on theirs. Back in Ramirez's office, the door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the noise of the reporters and the rest of the precinct. But the tension in the room was even thicker now. Samantha couldn't hold it back anymore. Her voice broke the silence like a whip. "This is spiraling out of control," Ramirez said, his tone tight, the weight of the situation clearly sinking in. "No," Samantha snapped, spinning to face him. "This is exactly what needed to happen. We can't let people like him keep running things. Daniels, the rest of them, they need to know this isn't their world to control anymore." Ramirez ran a hand over his face, his expression torn. "You've made your move, but now the question is, what comes next?" Samantha took a deep breath, meeting his gaze head-on. "We keep going. We don't back down." She moved to her desk, her fingers skimming over the pages of reports, but the words blurred together. Her mind refused to focus fully on the case details. The weight of what had just happened, and what was still to come, pressed down on her. Daniels had been removed, but his influence and the damage he'd caused were far from gone. If anything, the whole precinct felt like a tinderbox waiting for the next spark. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the files in front of her, trying to keep her thoughts clear. What had started as an isolated issue with Daniels was quickly becoming something much bigger. The evidence she had uncovered, the whispers of corruption running through the department, the faces of officers now uncertain about where they stood, it was all piling up, and it was all connected. The knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts, and before she could respond, Harris entered. His face was grim, his usual confidence replaced by a kind of quiet urgency. "We're with you," Harris said, his voice steady but laced with the weight of the decision they were making. "But this isn't going to be easy. If we push this forward, we're going to make enemies out of some powerful people." Samantha's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not afraid of enemies. What I'm afraid of is letting this slide and proving them right, that they can keep getting away with it." The room was silent for a moment, the gravity of the situation settling over them like a storm cloud. Detective Harris finally broke the silence, leaning forward, his expression firm. "We've already started sorting through the evidence," he said, gesturing to the folders and screens scattered across the table. "There are bank records, falsified reports, even ties to outside groups. If we go public with this, it's going to shake the entire department and beyond." Samantha's jaw tightened. "Good, that's exactly what needs to happen. If we don't root this out now, it'll only keep spreading." One of the other officers in the room, a younger detective named Morales, spoke up hesitantly. "But how do we do this without turning the entire precinct against us? If we lose their trust, we'll be fighting this battle alone." Samantha looked at Morales, her eyes sharp. "We don't need their trust. We need the truth. And the ones who care about doing the right thing will come around. The rest, they'll just expose themselves for who they really are." Harris nodded, though his expression remained grim. "If we're doing this, we'll need to move fast. We don't know how much time we have before word gets out that we're digging this deep. They'll try to cover their tracks, or worse, come after us." Samantha stood, her resolve unshakable. "Then we start tonight. Gather everything we have and prepare it for release. If this is as big as we think it is, we need to make sure it can't be buried." The room buzzed with quiet determination as the team got to work. Samantha's heart pounded, but it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. This was what she had prepared for, what she had fought for, and now there was no turning back. Samantha leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table as her fingers interlaced tightly. "Waiting for him to make a move is risky," she said, her voice low but insistent. "If we give him too much time, he'll cover his tracks, or worse, find a way to silence us. We need to force his hand." Harris frowned. "And how do we do that without tipping him off?" A plan began forming in her mind, one born from the hours she'd spent poring over files and observing the subtle dynamics in the precinct. "We set a trap," she said slowly. "If Daniels is as desperate as we think, he'll act if he feels cornered. We need to make him think we're about to uncover something big, something that puts him directly in the crosshairs." Ramirez tilted his head, considering her words. "You're suggesting we bait him into making a mistake?" "Exactly," Samantha replied. "He's arrogant, and he's not going to let us take control of this without a fight. If we plant the right piece of information, something that makes it look like we've found a key lead, he'll move to shut it down. That's when we strike." Morales, who had been quiet until now, spoke up hesitantly. "What if he doesn't take the bait? Or worse, what if he turns it on us?" Samantha's gaze hardened. "That's why we have to be smart about it. Whatever we put out there has to be believable enough to draw him in, but vague enough that he can't immediately disprove it. And we have to be ready when he comes for us." Ramirez crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. "This could work, but it's a tightrope. If Daniels figures out we're setting him up, he'll spin it to make us look like the aggressors." "That's why we need to control the narrative," Samantha said. "We don't just wait for him to react. We make sure we have people watching his every move. When he slips up, we'll have the proof we need to take him and his allies down." Harris nodded, a glimmer of resolve returning to his eyes. "All right," he said. "Let's figure out what kind of bait we're putting out there. If we're doing this, we need to get it right the first time." Samantha exhaled, the weight of their decision settling over her. She knew the risks, knew how easily this could blow up in their faces, but if they didn't act now, they might never get another chance. "Let's get to work," she said. "We're taking Daniels down, on our terms." As Samantha walked down the hallway, her mind churned through the strategy ahead. Each step echoed her resolve, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed down harder with every moment. The precinct felt charged, alive with tension, like a taut wire waiting to snap. Every passing glance from her colleagues carried a question, an unspoken challenge, or worse, a silent accusation. She didn't flinch. The meeting room was already full when she arrived. Ramirez stood at the head of the table, briefing the small group they had assembled, officers she had handpicked over the last few weeks. They weren't all squeaky clean, but they were people who valued integrity enough to stand with her, or so she hoped. "Reynolds," Ramirez said, acknowledging her as she stepped inside. His voice carried a mix of caution and trust. "We were just talking about the plan moving forward." Samantha nodded and stepped forward, addressing the group directly. "We can't afford hesitation anymore," she began, her tone firm. "Daniels and the people backing him are counting on us being too scared or too divided to act. But this ends now. If we can dismantle the network he's built, we don't just win this fight, we take back this precinct." "How?" one of the officers, a young man named Vargas, asked skeptically. "If we go after the wrong person or tip our hand, we're finished. You've seen how fast the department turns on its own." Samantha locked eyes with him. "We go after their connections, the people Daniels has relied on to keep his operations quiet. We start with the records, calls, finances, partnerships. If we can disrupt the flow of information and money, we weaken his power base. But we also need people inside their circle. That's where you all come in." The room fell quiet as everyone exchanged uncertain glances. Ramirez cleared his throat. This isn't going to be easy. If you're not in this for the long haul, now's the time to step back. No one moved. Samantha let the silence stretch a moment longer before continuing. This is about more than Daniels. It's about showing everyone in this department, hell, in this city, that corruption isn't untouchable, that people like us still have the power to fight back. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Ramirez stepped forward, his voice steady. All right. We start gathering intel on Daniel's inner circle. Financial ties, irregular activity, whatever we can find. Samantha, you'll coordinate with Harris on how we're going to feed him false leads without tipping him off. Samantha nodded, her mind already racing with the possibilities. Let's get to work, Ramirez said. As the group began to disperse, Samantha caught Ramirez's arm. Thank you, she said quietly. He gave her a small, tired smile. Don't thank me yet. We're walking a fine line, and the only thing keeping us balanced is you. Just don't lose sight of why we're doing this. I won't, she said firmly. And as she walked back to her office, she felt the fire in her chest burn brighter. This wasn't just about taking Daniels down anymore. It was about rebuilding everything he and his kind had broken. The weight of the decision pressed down on Samantha as she turned and walked out of the office. The hallway stretched out before her, each step a reminder of the danger that loomed just beyond the doors. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, like the calm before a storm. Everything hinged on the next move, and she had no intention of backing down now. She entered the war room, where Harris was already at work, his tablet filled with data, lines of encrypted files and digital trails that needed to be followed. The others were there too, officers she'd come to trust over the course of this chaotic battle. Their faces were tired, worn by the pressure, but there was an underlying determination in their eyes. They knew what was at stake. We're not just up against Daniels anymore, Samantha said, her voice steady. This goes much deeper than we ever anticipated. We need to start connecting the dots. Fast. Harris looked up, his expression somber. You're right. IA's pulling everything, but the bigger picture isn't going to be easy to uncover. Whoever's behind this has been covering their tracks for years. I don't care how deep it goes, Samantha replied, the fire in her eyes evident. We expose them. We don't just fight for the truth. We fight to take them down, piece by piece. One of the officers, a young detective named Larkin, raised an eyebrow. And what about Daniels? If we go after his people, he'll know we're closing in. Samantha's gaze hardened. That's the point. We need him to make a move. If he thinks we're playing it safe, he'll slip further into the shadows. But if he knows we're coming for him, he'll make the first mistake. And when he does, we'll be ready. Ramirez entered the room just then, his expression grim but resolute. We've got the logs, calls, transactions, meetings. We can't wait for them to make a move. We need to control the narrative, get ahead of them. Agreed, Samantha said. She paused for a moment, the weight of the plan settling over her. We'll take them down one by one. Get me everything. We trace the calls, track the money, and follow the patterns, and we do it fast. She turned to the group, her voice growing stronger with each word. This isn't just about cleaning up the department. This is about sending a message. No one is safe from the truth. No one is untouchable. Not Daniels, not anyone. They all nodded, their faces hardening with resolve. Each of them had their own reasons for standing with her. Some were fighting for their own redemption, others for the future of the precinct. But Samantha knew that together they could dismantle the corrupt empire that had taken root. As she left the room, the weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders. But there was no turning back now. The battle lines had been drawn, and the storm was coming. All she could do now was stand firm and fight with everything she had. Ramirez nodded, his gaze lingering on the cluttered desk in front of her, a testament to the weight of their task. We've got a window, but it's closing fast. The longer this goes on, the more people will scramble to cover their tracks. We need to move quickly, get to those cracks before they can seal them up. Samantha's fingers tightened around the pen she'd been absent-mindedly playing with. The pressure was mounting. But it was no longer just about survival. It was about ensuring that no one else in the department fell prey to the same corruption that had consumed Daniels and his allies. "Right," she said, standing up and pacing toward the window. "The network is vast, and it's deeper than we thought. But with Daniels out of the picture, that's one less layer we have to peel back. It's time to start targeting the people who might be scared enough to talk. The ones who feel trapped in the system." She turned back to face him, her resolve hardening. "We go after those on the periphery first. The ones who've been pulling the strings without getting their hands dirty. The ones who think they can hide behind Daniels's shadow. We take them down before they even realize what's happening." Ramirez crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. "You're talking about people who've been in the game a lot longer than Daniels. Some of them are connected to bigger players. It's not just about taking down the small fry anymore." "Exactly," Samantha replied. "We take down the ones who are still holding the strings. We break the system from the inside, piece by piece." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of their shared understanding. They both knew what it meant to expose this kind of corruption. It would destroy careers, reputations, maybe even lives. But the alternative was letting the poison fester and spread, and neither of them was willing to stand by and let that happen. "We need to be ready for backlash," Ramirez warned, breaking the silence. "There will be people who won't go down without a fight. You've already got enemies, and with this, you'll make more." Samantha's jaw clenched. "I've been ready for that from the start." Ramirez studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's start compiling everything we've got, find the connections we haven't spotted yet. We can't afford to make mistakes." Samantha didn't need to hear more. She turned to the team gathered in the room, their faces a mix of determination and fear. This wasn't just about clearing the department's name, it was about dismantling a corrupt empire. The real work was just beginning. Samantha's journey, though fraught with personal sacrifice and danger, represents the unwavering commitment to justice in a system that's been warped by corruption. She didn't choose the easy road, nor did she shy away from the consequences of her actions. In every step she took, from confronting Daniels to navigating the murky waters of departmental loyalties, she was driven by something bigger than herself, the desire to expose the truth and restore integrity. There will always be moments in life that challenge us to do what's right, especially when the consequences are steep. Much like Samantha, we all face decisions where doing the easy thing may seem tempting, where staying silent or turning a blind eye might offer temporary relief. But in the end, it's the choice to persist in the face of adversity, to stand for what's just, that leads to real change. Samantha's story is a reminder of the power of one person to challenge a flawed system, and that the pursuit of accountability, though difficult, is what can change the narrative for everyone. And as you think about your own experiences, remember, sometimes the long road, the road filled with hardship and uncertainty, is the one that leads to a better, more just future. We all have a part to play, whether it's standing up against injustice, supporting others who are speaking out, or simply holding ourselves accountable to our values. What would you have done if you were in Samantha's shoes? Would you have risked it all for the truth? Let's continue this conversation. What does accountability mean to you, and how can we work together to build a world where change is possible? Your thoughts could be the spark that inspires others to take action, no matter how small. Share your reflections in the comments below. The journey might be long, but it's one worth taking.